Well, I just wanted to welcome everybody to our Living Building series, which we're calling Making Nashville Living Building Ready. And I'll go into a little more detail on what that means. But, basically, this is an opportunity to have a discussion, and we're planning a series of 3 of these that will occur. We're planning one for this summer, and then also one in the fall when our students return. I wanted to let everyone know that this is co-sponsored by our student chapter of the American Society of Civil Engineers as well. And you'll see on our cover sheet that we have multiple sponsors. And one of the big sponsors is our Future DU, which is our land use plan. But it really goes beyond just simple land use principles, and that it involves more what I would call aspirational aspects. So it has a lot to do with diversity and inclusion, has a lot to do with communities, and of course, why we're here today is sustainability. So Josh, we can advance. So here's some of our guiding principles. And so this really gives us a true north as we evaluate our projects. So from this, as far as in sustainability, we started by doing a renewable energy study that's underway now, that we're actually well into the process. And then also, just this week, we've kicked off our blue sky vision. And really what that is, it's looking at the university's energy needs for the next 20, 50, 100 years. And we want to explore options of going to carbon neutral solutions and potentially renewable solutions. So we really want to identify what that is and what it would take to get there. But if we could advance one more, this is just showing kind of Vanderbilt's progress in kind of our greenhouse gas monitoring. We started back in 2005, and you can see we've had some substantial reduction to 2015, and then a great reduction to 2017. And that represents when our coal-burning power plant came offline and we went to natural gas-fired turbines for our cogeneration. But this is really, and then we're looking at different paths forward, directions we can take to further reduce our greenhouse gases and introduce renewables. Again, this is looking at the supply side of our energy, but then what we're going to talk about today is the demand side. So if we could flip ahead, Josh. Addressing our demand side, we've done 17 LEED certified projects on campus, and we have other projects in the pipeline. We're currently in the engineering and science building that's soon to be certified as LEED Gold. And then I just wanted to add a note that one of our students, Jay, has developed an app that information will be available, but it's a self-guided tour and of the building, but it uses beacons, and these beacons will take you through the building to talk about the sustainability features. And this is just a draft, and tonight is the first run on this, so we'll see how that goes.
You explained.
And then some of our other projects were, like on the nursing school, is our first project we're pursuing a WELL certification. It will be the first WELL certified project in Nashville that has to do with well-being of the occupants. And then we're also looking at pursuing some LEED or living building petals on some of our other projects. So Josh, moving ahead. So anyway, in concept, we're going to go into a lot more detail on what our living buildings, but in concept, they're renewable buildings. They produce more energy than they use. They create potable water from the water that falls on the site. They treat their gray water and black water, again, on their site. But then it addresses quality of life issues for the users to create these optimal environments for humans to thrive. It also, addresses aesthetics. So the logo of the flower represents the petals, but then it also represents the aesthetics and the idea that any living building should have a high aesthetic quality to it. So anyway, I was going to touch on a little bit about making Nashville Living Building ready. So there's been a group of us, when I say group of us, Vanderbilt, members from the U.S. Green Building Council, members from the mayor's office, and other groups of Metro, I've been going around and meeting with all the folks that would be necessary to do a living building in Nashville. So that's going to involve doing changes in codes, getting variances. So we've met with Metro Codes, with the health department. We've met with, even going to the state environment conservation, because they would regulate us as a utility producer as far as creating our own potable water. So the response has been positive, and I think everyone initially is a little skeptical, but then once they understand the concept, then people are on board to support it. So I think we're in a good position to move forward. And with that, this is just a little note talking about the app that's been developed for the building tour. And then also I just wanted to recognize Carolyn Jansen, and Carolyn will be introducing the speakers, but before then I wanted to turn this over to Kim Shinn so he could speak briefly about the Living Building Collaborative that's forming in Nashville.
The Living Building Challenge is actually a program of something called the International Living Future Institute. And they have established a network of interested people around the country who form what are called collaboratives. And myself and Paul Marshall here with Vanderbilt have become the co-facilitators for establishing a living building collaborative here in Nashville. So by coming here today and giving us your email, you are now on the email list for the collaborative. So watch for future messages from us about what's going on with the collaborative. In true collaborative nature, we continue to work closely with the U.S. Green Building Council chapter in Tennessee, as well as the AIA Committee on the Environment. So we look to establish relationships and share events and common vision with those groups as well. So thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thank you, Ken. Caroline?
Hello everyone, I'm Caroline. I'm a student officer here with the Vanderbilt chapter of the American Society of Civil Engineers, and I get the immense pleasure of introducing our speakers for the session today. First we have Larry Lord, who is a principal at Lord X Sargent. He was a founding principal of Lord X Sargent, as Larry provides leadership for a wide range of institutional facilities with complex technological requirements. His interest in regenerative design began in the late 1970s during the energy crisis with the design of the Georgia Power corporate headquarters, which in 1981 was then judged as the most energy conservative high-rise building in the world, and continues today with LEED certified projects, including LEED Platinum Laboratory Building. Beginning as a national leader with AIA Inform, a national movement to teach organizational leadership, architects, engineers, and students about energy conservative design, Larry continues to share his experience through his project leadership, as well as AIA, ASHRAE, Tradeline, and many academic workshops. We also have Mr. Joshua Gassman, who's Sustainable Design Director at Lord X Sargent. For nearly 20 years, Joshua has led large, multifaceted design teams focused on sustainable design, including net positive water and net positive energy projects. During his career, he's managed a broad spectrum of projects, including those LEED certified and recognized nationally, ranging from large research labs from major universities to interpretive and educational centers. He's currently leading the design team for the Condata Building for Innovative Design at Georgia Tech, aiming to be the most sustainable building ever built in the southeastern U.S. And with that, I'll hand the stage off to our wonderful speakers.
Thanks, Caroline. Thank you, and it's very exciting to be here today. We look forward to talking with you not only today, but over the next couple of different sessions that we have. The living building, for me, is that it's all about giving more and taking less from the earth and from human existence. So, but in order to get started, Josh and I would like to just try to learn a little bit more about you. So I was going to ask, how many of you are students? They're all students. Certainly. Anyway, faculty? Faculty? Okay, and campus architects, engineers, operations, maintenance. All right. And local government or state people, couple back there, yeah, and just others from Nashville. Okay. All right, and then I thought just to kind of get us in the mood here is that I'd like to know what you're doing for your part of this whole movement. How many of you ride a bike, take public transportation, walk to work and school? Not enough. Okay. How many?
Hold on, we're not supposed to eco-shame people. Hold on. That's
how many of you avoid the use of plastics? All right. How many turn off the lights when you leave the room? How many of you diligently recycle? Very good. How many take short showers? And then how many compost leftover food? How many carry with you your bamboo fork and spoon? There he goes, right there. We should have somebody. All right. And then my favorite, how many, when you're in a public toilet, only use one paper towel to dry your hands? Okay, think about that one. Okay, I'd like to say that those that answered that are sustainability champions, and then we're beginning to work on how to be living building champions. So the man with the insane amount of information about living buildings is Joshua. So I'll turn it over to him now.
all right. Thanks, Larry. So the lapel mic I'm wearing for the room is behind me, and I can't tell. Is it on? Everybody hear me? Okay. Is it too loud? Okay, good. All right. I tend to be loud anyway. I don't need to blow your eardrums out. So to start with, I believe we can offer AIA credit for this, which requires us to show some learning objectives. I would say that you will learn something. I promise. May not be what I'm saying, but you'll learn something. But that's okay. We'll move on past that. So as Keith and Larry were saying, this is really the first of a series of workshops. So we want to touch on a lot of things. We've been designing the living, I should back up. We started the project by calling it the Living Building at Georgia Tech. And then it got named about 3/4 of the way through the process. And its formal name is too long. Caroline was so generous as to read it earlier. But we affectionately started calling it the Candida Building. But in my head, it's still the Living Building at Georgia Tech. So I'm going to be interchangeable here. But the idea behind this workshop, and then the subsequent ones as well, is to try to take a little bit deeper dive into the design process and the results and what it's like to do this and the level of effort that it takes, and to hopefully offer lessons to students and professionals and other and faculty and everyone involved in this movement, and try to try to be a little bit inspirational, but also try to be a little bit educational. Today we're going to focus a little bit on some early living building basics. I want to make sure that we're all starting with kind of a baseline of information. I think everyone's heard of the Living Building Challenge because everyone's here, but I want to make sure that we're not going off the deep end without some baseline knowledge. And then I'll talk a little bit about what the building is. That means I'll show you some really pretty pictures, kind of like the rendering that's up there right now. I usually save that for the very end, but in this case, actually, I want you to all have images about what it is that we're talking about in terms of design before we dive into more technical stuff. So the last part of today I'll spend talking about net positive energy and how we got there, what it took. You'll see that net positive energy by itself is not a singular thing. It is actually many things across many pieces of the design process. And so, and that's probably about as far as we're going to get today. In fact, even that I'm prone to go long, so we may go as far as we can in that, and then next time we convene, we'll start to look at some of the other petals, namely water, which will be one of the more interesting ones, especially as you were mentioning, Keith, that water has a lot of regulatory hurdles and not so many technical hurdles, so we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the third workshop, we can talk about some of the other petals and the challenges that they present and the opportunities that they also present. So first, a little bit about why we want to do this, right? We're interested in creating meaningful environments for people. We want to design climate science labs and other fun buildings. We are not interested in designing bomb factories. in terms of how we get there, LEED has become ubiquitous, right? LEED is everywhere, and I think it's really important to acknowledge the USGBC and the LEED program as having piloted and really, on some level, accomplished what they started out to do, which is to change the marketplace and change the dialogue. The problem is that when you start to think about what true sustainability is, this is one way to start to think about it. This is another way to start to think about it, is that even the best LEED building right now on the newest system is just barely getting you to something that's actually sustainable in terms of resource use and what you're creating. And so the Living Building Challenge is really trying to push us, although it may not quite be there yet, although it does a better job than any other certification program out there, really pushing towards true regenerative design, hence the requirements for net positive energy, net positive water, et cetera. And yes, a code compliant building is kind of crappy, but I will say in defense of all the codes, and particularly of ASHRAE, as codes continue to develop, we are going in a very good direction. And in fact, actually by the time you get to 2030-ish, something like net zero buildings are going to be the code requirement, at least if people like me have their say in ASHRAE and the building codes. So we'll see where all this goes, but this is a current statement, not necessarily a future commentary on the status of the code. So the Living Building Challenge. It's called a challenge for a reason. It is asking us as a design team, and is asking Georgia Tech as an owner to fundamentally rethink the process of design and construction, what it means to build in a city, in this case, which is a big deal because most living buildings out there that have been certified are not urban. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But so, Keith, as you had hinted a minute ago, the Living Building Challenge is based on the metaphor of a flower. So the idea of the flower leads us to talk about petals, and then each petal is a different category. I'll talk about that in a second. But the idea of the flower is also a metaphor for the way a living building should be, right? It should be beautiful. It should also harvest all of its own resources in place. It should generate all of its own energy. And when it's decommissioned, in the case of a flower, it starts to decompose, it gives back into a nutrient cycle. So there's no waste on the front or the back end. So the petals here, if you're familiar with the LEED organization system, the petals start to mirror that a little bit. Water and place and energy, health and happiness, where LBC really starts to differ. LBC has a beauty requirement. LBC has an equity requirement. And these are some of the other petals that maybe we'll talk about a little bit further on. For today, we are going to focus on energy. But I would like to call attention to, even though materials is not the subject of this discussion, that the materials petal is where most of the meat and the muscle of the Living Building Challenge is trying to be, and trying to remove toxins from the built environment. And the toxins that are on the red list, as it's called, are really looking not just at if it's toxic in the building, like VOCs that might be off-gassing, but also looking at whether or not certain products are toxic at their source, at their manufacturing, whether or not they're toxic post-life, and what happens to them after the building is deconstructed. And so that it also starts to fold in some equity principles in terms of environmental justice, and most of the chemicals that are made around communities that then can't speak for themselves and advocate for cleaner production, et cetera. So the materials petal, subject of its own workshop here. Each of those petals is broken down into... So, is that a drill? I'm going to keep going unless someone tells me it's... Okay.
Attention. An emergency has been reported. All occupants walk to the nearest stairway.
Let's check this.
So, all right, so let's hold for station identification to be continued.
We're going to check this out for you.
Not use the elevator. Walk to the nearest stairway.
All right, so the test of a decent public speaker: can you get interrupted and pick up where you left off? I don't know if I'm going to pass this test. Okay, so each of the petals is subdivided into a number of what are called imperatives, and that's because by the time you get through this program, what you find, excuse me, if you're looking for full certification, which the Candida building is, that there is no picking and choosing. There's no selecting points or pieces that you might want to pursue. They are imperatives. You must conform to everything in the system. And that is a key point to the Living Building Challenge. So we're not talking about buildings that are really good with water and energy, but not very good with other things. This is complete package. Everything works together, and it's called a living building, which is really important. The Living Building Challenge, this is the latest graph that's available. The data is from 2015, but you can start to see near exponential growth in the interest in the living building program. This actually has gone, this continues to rise at an extremely steep rate. But like I said, they haven't published the data yet for a newer year. And that's us, where the green arrow is pointing to in Atlanta at the Candida building at Georgia Tech. So one of the other things that really distinguishes the Living Building Challenge is it is based on results. So for those of you familiar with LEED, if you are looking at energy points, you do a model and you compare that model to a baseline code building, and the percentage better that you do is how many points you get. But actual performance of those buildings and the modeled performance of those buildings, based on pretty extensive research across the design and construction community, has proven that they do not compare favorably in a vast majority of cases. And that's because there are a lot of real-world things that happen in buildings that cause energy use to change, to differ from what you would otherwise expect. And so the Living Building Challenge says, don't model it, do whatever you want to do. What we care about is that after you run the building for a year, after it's fully occupied, that the project is net positive energy, that the project is net positive water, that the project is net positive waste. And so these are all really important in terms of creating true change and really moving all of us actually as a society forward towards truly sustainable construction. So this John Muir quote is among my favorites, and I found this through the process of the Candida building design to be eminently true. Every time we said, well, you know, can we do this other thing over here differently? Because you know, as an example, we actually proposed revolving doors on an academic institutional building, and everyone said, well, you can't do revolving doors. That's crazy. We said, well, okay, you don't want to do revolving doors. That's fine. We can pull out revolving doors. Well, now we have 3 other problems that we have to solve that have to do with how many more solar panels we need because we just increased our energy use by 10%. How many more ACHs or air changes of air now come in the building, even with the vestibule. And now we have a dehumidification problem in the summer, so we have to beef up that piece. We have to change the thresholds on all of our systems. So all these things start to snowball. And so when you start to get near the end, you end up with a really cohesive 4-dimensional whole that really holds together almost like an ecosystem. And that is effectively the goal here. So the Candida Building for Innovative Sustainable Design. Just on the first front, I need to make sure I acknowledge I am the voice today of this team, but there are a tremendous number. We have 10 consultants on our team, plus the Candida Fund, whose name I misspelled on the slide. Candida Fund, not find. And as well as Georgia Tech, our collaborating architects, the Miller Hole Partnership out of Seattle, as well as our engineering team, all across the boards, across disciplines. It was a tremendous team effort. It's not just any one group. We started the process at the very beginning, actually in a design competition, squared off against 3 other extremely capable, extremely great firms. One of the things that we were really interested in doing was saying what's available, what's out there in terms of climate, right? And so we looked at Atlanta's climate, and Atlanta's climate is this orange zone, I don't know which one of these to point to, that's right here in the southeast, and Nashville's more or less in the same climate zone there. But we were interested to really reduce energy. What can we learn from other cultures around the world, as well as vernacular architecture in the southeast? And so we started looking at cultures all around the world. So every one of these orange zones with a circle around them on the map is a different culture that handles the same climate zone in a different vernacular way. And so you put that together with deep study of the Southeast, and what we found, the things that are present on the site and the things that make Atlanta special and interesting are trees, and culturally, you start to look at porches. So we became very influenced by these things as we looked at progressing with the design of the project. So for those of you not familiar with Atlanta, the orange circle is about Georgia Tech's campus there. Orange, yellow circle is about Georgia Tech's campus. And this is a sector of their campus. The yellow bubble is the approximate 8-acre site that we were told to explore and put the building anywhere we wanted to on that site. When we started digging into it, what we found is we looked at some older topographic maps, and we can talk a little bit more about this at one of the other workshops as we talk about the place pedal and understanding place and what's going on the site. But needless to say, the orange section cut is the 1928, what I would refer to as sort of the original undisturbed topography on the site. The gray is the current topography on the site. So this site has been significantly disturbed, and so we wanted to figure out how to respond to that in knowing that we couldn't own the entire 8 acres, but only about 1 acre and a third or so through the design of this project, but what's the best way to reinforce that and respond to it? So we started looking at different ways to do it. We said, what if we put it in this corner, and what if we move it over here, and what if we put it kind of actually off the site with a big south-facing building, and what if we did it differently over here? And what if we put it over here? We affectionately referred to that one as the site of death. We found out later that Georgia Tech hates that site, so we're really glad we didn't pursue that scheme. But we wanted to make sure we left no stone unturned as we went through this process. What we landed on was looking at the site in this way. So for everyone familiar with building orientation, I'll talk a lot more about building orientation in a minute, but what you'll see is north is up, and yeah, the building faces west. That's normally not something you want to do in a high-performance building because the western facade will take lots of beating from the sun, and that is a real challenge. But what we found is there are any number of other really compelling design ideas that really want this to be the scheme, and it is really the right way to respond to the site. And so what we did was we created a porch on the west side, and then that vertical arrow here is a new pedestrian walkway entrance to the campus so you'll move right through up against this building. And then we've got a program that's fairly flexible, so we've got a nice western edge of porous pieces of the program, an atrium in the middle, and then a fairly solid piece of program on the eastern side. And as it happens, as you cross the street, that's just off over here, there's a large loading dock for a nanofabrication facility, which is both loud and, the architects who designed it did a great job making it look as good as it could be, but it's still a loading dock. And so starting to orient the building towards this as yet to be developed Eco Commons, which is a passive recreation and stormwater management tool on the campus, represented by the green areas there, became really the focus of the design. So this is a more rendered version of that site plan. You can see the building in here, and I'll talk a lot more about the site. I just want to sort of touch on the tops of the waves here so everyone understands more the challenges in terms of the energy side when we get to it. But the site steps down as you go up, so as you go north. So each of those differing variations of orange are going down as you go further into the site. Quick section starting to look at the porch area. So what we did was we took the photovoltaic panel that we knew we needed and we offset it from the footprint of the building to create a really large overhang that can then really help us shade that western facade. By doing that, we create a porch. We also create an opportunity for outdoor living areas, outdoor learning areas, excuse me. But we also create a connection between that walkway you saw in the earlier diagram and campus entrance and this porch space, as well as, and you'll see a common theme here, everything in this project has to do 3, 4, 5 different things at once, as well as managing stormwater to mitigate runoff, as well as actually creating what we're calling a foraging landscape to meet the urban agriculture component of the Living Building Challenge, where we actually have to grow food for both people and animals on the site. So all of that comes together and draws a completely different connection as you experience the site compared to a more conventional construction. The site briefly is broken down into 3 or 4 different tiers of planting. So we've got larger trees, and then as we go into bioswales and other components, we start to change the height of the shrubbery, and each one of those colors of green is actually mimicked off of a different ecosystem in the Piedmont region of Georgia, and so we're looking to be super sensitive in terms of the way we design the site as well. In terms of what the building actually is, because I know that's the burning question on everyone's mind, the purple space or pinkish space here is a 170-seat auditorium. We ended up making a flat-floored auditorium. Actually, it's not very different than about the scale of this room. And the idea is to create a very flexible space so you can clear the seats out and have events and do those types of things. The gray space is the student commons. I'll show you some renderings of that. That's a very open space where students can gather and learn. That's where the site starts to terrace, and that terracing translates into the building, and so that comes through. There's a maker space on the southwest corner, which now north is towards me, so west is actually up now. This is a maker space, which was really important for Georgia Tech to put that type of activity on the corner where it's extremely public, people can see, make it very active. And then the bar on the east that was the closed piece of the program in the diagram is offices, classroom, laboratories, and the building core with the toilets and elevator. And so a quick view of that, so that's standing in that student center looking back up so you can start to see the terraces, occupiable stairs. If someone wants to see it later on during Q&A, this is actually a 3D fly-through if I can get my computer online, so we can rotate through it if that's of interest. And then on the second floor, you come up with a large atrium. There's a big opening in the floor to really connect the two levels. And on the west side, we have two large classrooms. These are about 70 seats each. And then again, on the eastern block, we have the class labs and the core. What we did on the auditorium is the floor-to-floors in this building are actually quite high. They're about 15 feet per floor. And we did that deliberately to allow for maximum daylight penetration. But as it happens, the hill steps down. We actually end up with about 21 feet floor to floor by the time we hit the auditorium space. And so that allows, excuse me, that allows us to come out here with that roof garden that's on grade with the second floor. And that then is actually also a part of our urban agriculture requirement, as well as a potential research project. One of the things we came across during the programming of the project is, because it's the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets, there are actually researchers who are actively studying bees on campus, and so we actually have a number of apiaries out on the roof, and then we're going to plant blueberry bushes up there, and so blueberries then gives you flowering plant, so you get pollen for the bees. It's also an edible plant for humans, and so again, trying to do multiple things at the same time. Just a quick shot of the roof so you understand the green dashed line and shaded area is the footprint of the enclosed space of the building, and the PV array then, as you can see, it creates that porch space on the west as it cantilevers out. Quick rendering, this is the south facade where we do take advantage of some of that overhang from the PV array, but also separately shading the south over here, and this is for those of you who don't know, the south is relatively easy to control solar gain. You have a cutoff angle in the winter and in the summer, and you can put some horizontals out there, and that part of the puzzle is fairly straightforward to solve. This is from the entrance on the south of the building. Look back to the north. You can see on the second story out to the roof garden, as well as how the building starts to terrace down with both occupiable stairs and ramps to move you through the building. From the second floor, looking sort of down into that student common space with the class labs on your right. And then a final rendering of the porch, sort of looking back up the hill. All right, and so that's your tour of the building. I hope everyone has a good mental picture of what it looks like, where we're going with this. So, we need to talk about lots of things that affect net positive energy. We have thermal comfort, we have daylighting, we have glare, we have solar gain on the facade, we have what kind of mechanical systems you're using, then we have to study this extensively, ongoing through the entire process. And so we'll start with this, defining comfort. And I would tell you this is something that ASHRAE as a guide frequently says, well, people should be comfortable at 72 degrees and 50% relative humidity, plus or minus a little bit on both of those depending on the time of year. Well, normally, this room is pretty comfortable, I think, for the most part. Frequently, these rooms are way over-conditioned and therefore are much too cold. But those settings, that idea of 7250, it's very old. It's based exclusively on studies of men wearing wool suits from the 1960s and 70s. And it is not accurate in today's office, student, or almost any other environment. And so we spent a lot of time trying to think about what it really means to be comfortable. And so we had to define that. And this was an ongoing discussion for months with between PAE, our mechanical engineer, between our office, between Miller Hull, between Georgia Tech, between different pieces of the group at Georgia Tech. So for those of you who don't know, there are 6 different things that affect human comfort. But not all of them are in the design team's control, right? We can't dictate how people dress when they go into a building. But we can control humidity, we can control radiant temperature, we can control airspeed, and we can control air temperature. So 4 out of 6 isn't bad. This is the way engineers think about radiant comfort. Our engineering friend in the front's going, okay, yeah, that's the way that works. for the architects in the room and for everybody else who's not an engineer, this one. So one of the things we did at the beginning, too, is we wanted to look at Georgia Tech's campus standards and see how that might relate to this. So the Georgia Tech's campus facilities manual is called the Yellow Book. And so we used a lot of yellow in our graphics here. And so this yellow trapezoid here is the defining limits of what Georgia Tech called comfortable per their standards before we started working on this project. That's an extremely narrow band. Well, the narrower that band is, the more energy you spend making your building at that temperature or that humidity. And so we're trying really hard to think about comfort using these other factors, not just comfort and not just air temperature and humidity, to think about comfort in a different way. There are any number, if anyone wants to go do this, there are lots of free tools out there. This is the CBE tool, which is one of the better ones. It allows you to adjust and change all 6 of those factors and then start to look and see, hey, this is where the comfort zone, based on any number of studies that have been done, that predicts whether or not you'd be comfortable. We use this tool extensively. We also did some direct research as well. Georgia Tech had a big room where they said, well, we can think about an environmental room in a lab. Said, well, we've got students, and we said, well, we've got $5 gift cards to Starbucks. Let's go. And so we offered Starbucks gift cards to students to sit in the room and to make comments about whether they were comfortable or not. Now, what we found was that the comfort that we found in that study didn't quite match the CBE tool, but that room couldn't simulate radiant temperature. It could only simulate airflow, humidity, and air temperature. And that's actually a really, really important piece of looking at that. But we were able to discern that 80 degrees and 60% humid is too warm and not quite comfortable enough, in spite of the fact that this tool actually says it is. So one of the things that we found is that all these tools, you'll notice on the psych chart, that the top lines, as these go up, start to show levels of humidity in the room. And the further up you go, the more humid it is. There's no upper bound on the comfort zone for humidity. And we realized pretty quickly that that was really a mistake. We really needed to limit humidity in the building, even though we were trying to look at defining comfort with these new tools and these new philosophies. We also started to zone the building, started to think about, well, if we're going to redefine comfort, maybe not all the spaces have to have the same level of comfort. So that student common space doesn't have to be the same as the auditorium, which doesn't have to be the same as the class labs. So we started to subdivide the building in that way. So all of this starts to say, well, all right, what kind of mechanical systems are you going to need to actually meet the load for whatever's left after you do make people comfortable? We looked at these 4 primary systems, and in the end, what we found was that radiant flooring, and so that's heating and cooling in the floor for heating and cooling loads, and then using a DOAS, or dedicated outdoor air system, for ventilation and dehumidification was the most energy efficient way to meet the loads that we had. And so that allows us to effectively take the entire floor of the building and turn it into a giant radiator of both cold and heat, depending on the time of year. Now, that type of system can be powered by just about any source, right? You could put a boiler on it, but the Living Building Challenge doesn't let you burn anything, which is a good thing because we want to try not to be burning things. You could go with a geothermal system, which is actually where we started the process. But one of the things that occurred to us was that even though there's a slight energy penalty for doing it, is that Georgia Tech had a campus chilled water loop. And that loop is, lots of campuses have chilled water loops. And one of the things that we realized was that if you put a heat exchanger on that chilled water loop and you draw cool water off of it in the summer, you're using energy, and that's okay. But if you run that heat exchanger backwards in the winter to generate heat for your building, you're putting cold water back in that system. And there are plenty of buildings, especially at any large research university, that has cooling demand 365 days a year, especially for large laboratory buildings. And so we're actually giving free cold water back to the system by heating our building. So that was one of the synergies that we found was actually a better strategy than geothermal. So the lesson here is study very carefully every decision that you're making. And like I said, we started with geothermal and ended up with this campus idea. So back to the west facade, which sort of become the focus of a great level of effort for our team. So we wanted to start everything, like we started the entire project, with passive ideas first. And so here's an image of the west facade. And so how do we figure out how to shade this as passively as possible? Well, you know, we've got the overhang, we've got the PV array as it sticks out, and that does a pretty good job of shading that top story. That's a pretty big overhang. But by the time you get to that bottom story, it's really not quite big enough. So we really need something else in there, figure out another way to shade that. So we said, well, can we shade with trees? We did a pretty good study here. We found that the answer is yes, you can shade with trees. But the trees have to be at least 40 feet tall. And we can't afford to buy 40 and 50 feet tall trees in our budget. So that's our long-term plan. And that actually is the life of the building strategy for shading the west facade, is to grow the trees. But until the trees are big enough, we need another strategy. We also looked at, okay, what if we put some sort of screen system in? And everything that we did here actually ended up becoming a head knocker and an impediment to people moving freely across that porch space. And so we really didn't want to end up adding any other architectural elements. We thought about, well, you know, you're trying to create a connection. Like all good architects, we said, well, let's put lots of glass in there. So, okay, well, hold on. We might need to rethink that. So we did some window wall ratio studies, and we actually, the building's at about 41% window wall ratio right now, in spite of the great connection that we've got to the west. So when we went through all of that, we said, okay, now we have a west facade. We've got to figure out how to shade those bottom pieces. So we looked at active systems, which I know for a lot of maintenance groups is really the bane of their existence. And I think that going through this is something that took some convincing of Georgia Tech and making sure that they were really comfortable with having active shading on the building. So again, just a reminder of the overhang there and the section through the building. We have a glare problem as well as a heat gain problem here. So we got to be careful about that. So you start to look at this elevation. We decided that the bottom shades really need to be active. So we're talking about active exterior Venetian blinds. And that's a system that prevents sunlight from ever hitting the glass, and also, because of that, controls glare in those spaces. We determined that the bottom, absolutely necessary, needs to be shaded. The top, however, was optional, and right now construction started about a month and a half ago, and so we're carrying the exterior shades on the top as an additive alternate. Right now they're not in the project, but we could add them back if we wanted to. We actually did a study. I decided to spare you the bar graph that goes with the study, but there's a study that we did that looked at how many hours the space, those two classroom spaces, were at 76 and 78 degrees, keeping in mind that 78 is actually our set point. With those shades, those rooms never go above 76 degrees. So there is a benefit to having them, but without them, the room never goes above the set point either, which is 78 degrees. So we were comfortable removing them, even though it's not the completely ideal condition. So a lot of this, by the way, this is like truth in advertising, right? We're not we're not trying to convince you that we're doing everything perfectly. There are compromises and there are things that we have to go through to make sure we're on track here. So this is a photograph of an existing installation of that vertical Venetian blind system, so people can get an idea of what that is. This is the Bullitt Center in Seattle. And one of the things that really ultimately convinced Georgia Tech that this system was okay in terms of maintenance was they talked directly to the maintenance guy at the Bullitt Center who's been operating this system for 6 or 7 years now and has had effectively no problems with it. And that made everyone feel a lot more comfortable with installing this. So when you get down to it, we did boatloads of analysis. We looked at expanding the comfort zone. I kind of glazed over, pun intended, the triple pane glass piece of this equation. That's sort of more part of an envelope discussion, but it significantly impacts this. What we found in terms of triple pane glass is that we could justify it because it keeps the building within a certain range, right? That radiant cooling slab has a relatively small capacity, so we have to keep the thermal gain on the building within that capacity, and the only way to get there was triple glazing. If we went to double pane glass, we had to add a mechanical system to the building. So that's a big deal in terms of finding synergy between systems. So, you know, looking at low energy systems, exterior operable blinds, and what do we get? Net positive energy. So this is the way architects, again, like to think about certain things. This is the sort of simple diagram thinking about, you know, the taller your building is, assuming that your roof area is your photovoltaic array, that your energy use has to go down the taller your building goes, right, with increased density. This is the way our mechanical engineer like to look at it. But, you know, you start to look at a CBEX building, which is, you know, an existing building component, and they're averaging an EUI of about 83. So that's energy use intensity. It's measured in kBTUs per square foot per year. So it's a way to level and start to think about how much energy a building uses. So we started looking at what it took to really get there and how we might get there. And this was an earlier diagram in our process where we were really targeting about 22-ish for our target EUI, and then we'd have to produce an equivalent EUI of about 24 in order to get to net positive. Well, one of the things that happened along the way is that the building went from operating during nominally normal business hours to 18 to 20 hour a day operation. That, in a lot of buildings, is okay, that's fine. You leave the doors open longer, keep it going. Well, for us, that actually increased our EUI by 33%. So our operating EUI right now in our analysis is closer to 35 because of the number of hours that the building is being used. So building use, the owner, part of the team, makes a big difference in terms of how all of this comes together. This is love this analysis, starting to look at energy, and people who are used to looking at energy model outputs are probably used to these types of graphs. But one of the things we started doing also was looking at how many PV panels that is. So it's important in a living building where you have to have net positive energy. Every time we add EUI to that bar graph, we add PV panels to the roof. And so, you know, to kind of end on where we really landed, about 35 as an EUI on the building. Now, technically our EUI is negative, right? Because we're generating enough power on site to offset 110% of that energy. But in terms of looking at it at energy use, that's our EUI. The PV array is about 280 kVA, and we're using about 350,000 kilowatt hours a year. Those are our latest model iteration based on the 100% construction documents. We have one more modeling iteration, and then we get to meter the building for real and see where we are after a year. The way the Living Building Challenge works is after everyone's moved in and Georgia Tech is fully using the building, it runs for 12 months. If we're not net positive after that, you drop the 13th month and you go one more month. If you're not net positive after that, you drop the last month and you add one more, and you keep going until you get 12 months of continuous data that shows that you're net positive at 10%. And then that's how you get to net positive. And then after that, you submit that, and you hopefully didn't have any other problems along the way, and you get certified. Thinking bigger picture, the idea here, and I think the idea of, Nashville starting to push towards this idea of living, building, ready, right? Removing barriers to systemic change is really the goal here. We like to talk on the team a lot about Roger Bannister. For those of you, he actually died very recently. We used to talk about him long before he died. But he was the first person to run a 4-minute mile. And people used to say it couldn't be done, couldn't be done. Well, Roger Bannister ran the 4-minute mile. And wouldn't you know it, within months, more and more and more and more people started running 4-minute miles. And all of a sudden it becomes the norm. Now you have people running marathons at a pace of under 4 minutes a mile. So this is Roger Bannister. Here we go. And to be continued with a focused discussion on water. I think I'm here for questions. Yes. Yeah, Mike.
The labs in the building, are they dry labs?
They are dry labs. The word lab is used kind of loosely. The building was not programmed in a conventional manner. Normally, right, we'd sit down with a user group or user groups, say, okay, what do you guys need? And we'll respond to that and create space for them. And then we'll go find, we'll figure out what the impacts in terms of water and energy are after that. Well, this building was the opposite. So we went back to the user groups and said, all right, you have 10 gallons a day of water and 3 watts per square foot of power. And so now you tell us what programs can go in the building. And while that was a really interesting way to do it, those programs weren't actually picked until about a month and a half ago. And we're under construction. But the programs that are going in the building, Mike, are biology, ecology, and earth and planetary sciences. So it's things that are relatively low use. And ecology and biology both can be pretty water intensive programs. So they have committed, the chairs of those programs have committed to figuring out how to live within the water budgets that we've given them based on the usage in the building and the capacity of the cistern. So, other questions? Yeah.
Did you guys consider using electrochromic glazing instead of the exterior Venetian blinds?
We did. In fact, I can't tell you how many times. Oh, okay. So the question was, did we consider electrochromic glazing in lieu of exterior blinds? We got called by Sage and Vision and all of the other manufacturers for this product many, many, many times through the process. And the reality of it is that those systems create several issues that we didn't want to deal with. One is even when they're not on, so they're not darkened, they have a color rendering issue. They tend to be slightly either gray or blue depending on the manufacturer, so we were not interested in that. We wanted the clearest glass we could get. The second one is that when the sun does hit them and they go dark, they go extremely dark and actually cause the room to go so dark that you can't daylight it anymore. And so we really wanted to find a solution that allowed us to daylight the building to the absolute maximum extent possible. And the Venetian blinds actually do that. They don't block so much light that the room can't still work without electrical lights on them. So, yeah?
Could you talk a little bit about who actually controls those Venetian blinds and how they control the power?
Yeah, sure. So the question was, how are the Venetian blinds controlled and who really takes charge of them? The answer is the BMS. So the building's automated system includes a weather station, and so that includes wind speed. So they automatically attract above certain wind speeds, and they automatically deploy when the sun is out. And so there are light sensors as a part of that system, and so they are not manually controlled. They're completely automated, and that's part of the reason they've been successful on other projects, because they do not depend on a human to activate them, or people can't override them, etc. And to dive off on a similar note, one of the things that the Living Building Challenge requires operable windows, not every 30 feet, but you, as an occupant in regularly occupied spaces, you always have to be within 30 feet of fresh air. And so we had a lot of very long discussions about whether or not those windows should be manual or BMS controlled and the implications of that and what it really meant. And what we found was that both the Georgia Tech's mechanical engineers on staff and our mechanical engineering team was extremely concerned with someone leaving a window open on, say, a July day, maybe in the evening, maybe it's okay, and then it doesn't get closed. And our mechanical systems are operating in a very narrow band, as I was discussing before, and so the ability for the building to recover from that type of mistake could be could impact comfort in the building for quite a while. So we decided that we wanted all of that to be automated. Yeah.
There's some questions about your PV system. One, are you using first most of the energy in the building and then selling excess to the grid if that's allowable on the campus, or is it being used elsewhere on the campus? Or?
So the question is, how are we using the PV grid in terms of net positive, and where is the energy going? Where's our excess energy going? So Georgia Tech, actually just like Vanderbilt, is behind 1 meter for the entire campus relative to the outward-facing utility. And so all the excess energy that we produce goes to offset energy used by adjacent or any other buildings on campus that are behind that meter. So eventually, you could get to a point where you could run that meter backwards, but it would take an awful lot of power generation to get there.
And one other, just from the rendering, the panels look great from underneath, but where do you put all the inverters and then wires?
So I would say that, so the question was, the panels look really good in the renderings, but they may not be totally true to life. Is that a fair characterization of the question? So a couple of things have happened on the project. So we actually bent over backwards trying to find a panel that was in fact translucent the way we've rendered them, and we did find a panel by a company called Trina that will make a glass with a translucent inner layer to give the effect that we've got. And each one of those panels has a box that's about 4 inches square, and they're all ringed together, and then the inverters are at the ends of those runs over the roof so you can't see them. And that was our plan. And we were sticking to it until a couple of things happened. One, we had current occupant of the White House impose some tariffs on photovoltaic panels. And we also been talking to lots of other building owners and owners of living buildings. And what we found is that these buildings are extremely well visited, and almost every single one of them has had more visitors and more usage on their water systems and on their electrical systems than they anticipated, because you're taking a guess as the design team on how many people are going to visit, and everyone's guessed low so far. So one of the ways that we decided to mitigate against that at Georgia Tech's request was to change all the power supply to a sun power panel, which is about 5% or so more efficient, but it is an opaque panel on the bottom. So our renderings are no longer accurate in that way. So we'll have, it'll be white on the bottom, and you will, because they're white, not translucent, be able to see a little bit of the boxes. But at the where the ground starts to step, that array is about 40 feet above your head, so it is far enough that the general sense will be there without having to call people's attention to those boxes. So, yeah.
So you kind of started off mentioning the challenge of moving for living buildings in an urban environment rather than out rural, and then towards the end you talked about the challenges as you start to become vertical. So looking forward from this project, what are your thoughts about thinking about living buildings in urban environments where land is really expensive?
So the question is, what about living buildings in urban settings where you increase density and land is expensive? There are, the Bullitt Center is really the best example of this, and that building is in a climate that has allowed them to push the EUI of that building extremely low. But even the Bullitt Center, I don't have a photograph of it, but that photovoltaic panel actually goes out over the sidewalk. They actually had to permit that building with Skyway permits from the city of Seattle to get it built. And so but that building was anticipated to be run at about 16 EUI, and its actual performance is closer to 11. So there, as a percentage, that's actually a huge benefit towards the project. So it's net positive, even though it was only designed to be net zero at the time. So I think as you start to go vertical, I think there's no doubt that there's a limit, right? And what that limit is will be determined based on the climate that you're in and how far certain things want to be pushed within the building. So for example, if someone said, relative to this discussion, that they were not comfortable allowing spaces to go up to 78 degrees and 55% humidity, then that EUI goes up correspondingly, and then your density would have to go down correspondingly. And so it's independent to a project dependent, I should say, to a certain degree. But I think there's no doubt that the more urban you get, the more challenging it becomes on a building over building basis. But I think the real opportunity, though, is to start to look at communities, and there is a Living Communities Challenge out there as another program, where you start to put buildings together. So you're not looking at one-offs, right? You're starting to look at neighborhoods and blocks of systems, so you can start to generate power across multiple buildings. You can start to, in the case of water treatment, which we'll talk a little bit more next time, but you can start to treat water in a combined way. And so you still have all the ecological flow and the low impact, but you're sharing the first cost of that system across multiple buildings. So those are kind of where it needs to go to really scale this up in terms of density.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, what about any other like energy generation sort of thing? Is PV it that y'all looked at, or did you look at solar, hot water, or wind, or anything like that?
So the question is, what else did we look at in terms of energy generation? And so we looked at everything that was out there when we started. We actually spent a little bit of time talking about piezoelectric, which is tiles in the floor that start to generate energy based on movement. And what we found was that to get to the levels of generation that we need to make a building like this work, that PV really is the only viable answer. Everything else is sort of an experiment that looks at a drop in the bucket. So piezoelectric, for example, you would need a sidewalk in Manhattan during rush hour to generate measurable amounts of electricity, right? So it's a cool thing, it's an awesome learning tool, it's a great opportunity, but the technology is not there to generate enough power for a building. Wind, Atlanta for wind is not great, and the level of square footage that you need per watt generated, wind is not on the chart for an urban environment. Now, if we were coastal, that could be quite different. If we were coastal and could tap into a very large, like commercial, utility scale turbine, then the conversation changes. But for this site in Atlanta, that's where our analysis led us. Yeah, Keith.
I was just curious about the radiant heating in the floor. Obviously would work well, but the cooling, has that been tested and is that tried and true in your climate?
So the question is about whether radiant cooling has been tested and whether it's tried and true or not. So I think there are a couple things about that. We asked a lot of the same questions because we were worried about that. The potential that slab gets so cold that you get condensation if the humidity in the building is high enough is a very real concern. And I guess we did a couple things. So one, this is actually a very common cooling strategy in India where it's hot and humid. And so there are projects out there, large projects, open projects with concrete flooring where that has not proven to be a problem. I wish I had the opportunity to go visit those. They're not in the project budget to go to India. However, Clemson's architecture school, designed by Pfeiffer & Associates out of New York, does have radiant cooling in their architecture building. And that building has been up and running for, I think, 3-4 years, that time horizon, and it has no vestibules. And so we went with our mechanical engineer, we went with the contractor, we said, all right, let's go look at this. And we rented a big van. We almost ran someone over in a parking lot one day. I wasn't driving. And we ended up with being pretty convinced that was viable technology. The way we're getting around it in terms of the building is the temperature of the slab in terms of its cooling capacity is pegged to the dew point in the building. So we're maintaining a delta of at least, I think it's 1.5 degrees between the two things, so we don't end up with the potential for condensation. But that ties back, like I said, pull a thread, everything else unravels. That's why building occupant control of windows is really scary to our team. And so that's why we wanted that on the BMS. That was really the driving one, was we didn't want condensation on the slab if the humidity suddenly shot up in the building. So, yeah.
You can answer this question. How did the design fees on this project compare to, I guess, a standard, a non-living building? I mean, obviously, you all put a lot of time into evaluating all these options. You had all these consultants. I mean, can you speak to that, how that compared?
So the question was about our team's fee with respect to conventional design projects. I would say that we went into it knowing we weren't going to make money, and that came true. That's that. I don't know if it's appropriate for me to say more than that, but that's the.
I mean, well, how do you see that? I mean, as you know, for this to be something that moves more into the mainstream, I mean, given that the engineers and architects ultimately do need to make money, how can that work in the marketplace? Because, that's obviously a concern of owners. I mean, when owners ask, well, how much more is this going to cost me to do this?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So question about, how does that pay forward? And we can't, as the design profession, continue to always lose money on every project, because even when you make it up in volume, you still end up on the losing stake, right? So the reality of it is a couple of things, I think. So one, if you start to look at what happened when LEED came on the marketplace, right? There were both design and construction premiums for LEED, and those slowly started to go away as people became more familiar with the system, they became more familiar with the process, and the things that were making it difficult and in terms of construction also started to go away as it became more normalized. I think living building isn't necessarily going to get there nearly as quickly as LEED did, and I think there are significant challenges with that, but I think part of it is understanding the big picture value proposition to an owner, and this, for better or for worse, economically plays much better to institutional owners than it does to, say, a developer, right? Because if you're going to build the building exclusively with the intent of flipping it 6 months after you've built it, this type of thinking is really hard to get through, right? That requires a different thought process. But on institutional buildings, what you start to realize is that this building has a higher first cost. I mean, the building is about $450 a square foot. And that includes all the PV, it includes the wastewater treatment, it includes the whole system, it includes all the site development. So that's actually a really economical price point in terms of institutional buildings in Atlanta. Georgia Tech, for a building with this program, would have probably normally spent a little less, but for an intensive laboratory could have easily spent 25 to 30% more. And so part of the point of the project is to demonstrate that a living building can be built at a sort of nominally normal price point for this building type. And so I think took a long time to get there, but we're in budget and we're moving forward with construction. And so I think we've proven that so far. What I think owners need to realize, though, is that by paying for PV and paying for additional design expertise and for paying for these water systems, is that you've now removed from the life cycle of the building your electrical bill, your sewer bill, and your water bill. And I think that is not insignificant over the course of 20 to 30 years. Now, you probably don't want to go more than that because your PV panels probably have to be replaced in 25 years, but just through degradation and advances in technology. But kind of, yeah, Mike.
Can you speak quickly, Joshua, to the challenges you had with code and regulatory issues?
Yeah, sure. So, what kinds of code and regulatory issues did we face was the question. So, in all fairness, Mike, that could be a very long answer. I'll try to give you the shortened version. So, for electrical and so for net positive power, we've had zero regulatory issues at all. We're behind Georgia Tech's meter, and as long as we have the code compliant disconnect switches and all the other things, so if power does go down, someone doesn't get electrocuted working on the lines elsewhere, we're good to go. Water has been much more challenging, and I think that's what most of these projects find, that rainwater to potable for anything more than a single-family residential house is extremely challenging. And what we found is we had to work with the EPD, which is Environmental Protection Division, at the state level, and we are applying, or Georgia Tech is applying, to become a public water utility. And so they had to go through this process. They actually hired a CUH2M Hill to do studies and to fill out, I mean, even the paperwork is, right, I mean, normally it's, how many acres is your watershed? 14,000 square feet, right, so there's a disconnect in the form even. So but we're working through that. They made us do water sample testing off of actual building materials. So we got a sample PV panel, a sample piece of the roof, and a sample of first flush filter, and we built a mock-up on a roof, and we've tested that water. We sent it to a certified lab, and now we've sent those results to the state. We actually haven't heard back yet, but that process has been completed. On the wastewater side, we're infiltrating our gray water, and we have no black water because we have composting toilets. Stay tuned for the next series because that's the baseline subject for that one. But the gray water infiltration wasn't necessarily a problem because septic systems are allowed, but they had assumptions about water flow rates that were absolutely insane because they just assumed that if you have a person, that person will be flushing a conventional toilet and they'll be wasting lots of water every time they wash their hands. And I mean, they asked us to hold something like 5-10-fold the volume that we're actually going to put into the system in terms of the amount of area on the site. And we had a challenge because that has to go into undisturbed soil in Georgia, at least in Fulton County. And if you remember that cross-sectional map, right, there's not a lot of that site that's undisturbed. And so we had to reserve that, and then that actually drove the shape of the building to a certain degree because that auditorium at the north end is encroaching on that undisturbed soil, and so it couldn't go past a certain point to make sure we had room to infiltrate our gray water at the downhill side. So that's, like I said, pull one thread, 3 other things move.
Is there one more question? Well, we can continue this conversation. There's a reception upstairs in the lobby, so if everyone could join up there, that'll be a great place to talk. And also, as I mentioned, we have that new app. So you can explore all the sustainable features of this building by going around and finding the beacons, and it's going to share information with you.